everybody, and welcome back to another Coffee Talk podcast episode. Today I'm actually drinking a coffee. I've been on a big tea kick lately. I like it a lot. I've been really cutting back on my caffeine, which is always nice. I'm down to about 1 coffee a day, and normally I actually have been drinking it black, which has been good for my sugar intake too. But today I actually put some creamer in my coffee because I wanted to enjoy a nice warm beverage. It's going to be a bit of a philosophical mindfulness type chat, which usually is the norm over here. And I want to discuss the idea of responding versus reacting. I have had this on my coffee talk board for some time. It is a concept I've been thinking about a lot in life lately and have been practicing a lot in life lately. And so I want to hear your thoughts. To start, actually, I'm going to give a little prompt to you. You can use this as an actual journal prompt if you're somebody that likes to journal, or if you would just rather take the prompt and answer it in the comment section down below. I'm super curious. What do you believe the difference of reacting versus responding is? What kind of situations might call for a reaction versus a response, and how can we get better at responding instead of reacting? In a very reactive way, when I think about this question, my initial response was actually much different than my actual response upon thinking about it. Reacting, I wrote down compulsive, instant, instinctual, peak energy, survivally driven, easy, and mindless. And none of these things are inherently bad. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a scientist or have done any great lengths of studies, but I do find human behavior very interesting upon just my own self-study in life. Like when I do things that I'm like, why do I do that? I genuinely want to know why I do that, and I go searching for answers. I've also struggled with mental health. I've also struggled with self-esteem. I've worked through my own sense of like blaming myself when in reality, a lot of the things that I used to blame myself for are very human things. So I find all of this stuff really interesting, and needless to say, in the context that I hear this in, I don't necessarily think reacting is a bad thing. In fact, our reactions to many things have likely kept us safe and allowed us to continue to thrive and survive upon so many generations and centuries of just threat and things that could very well just completely wreck us as the human species. That said, we are very complex beings, and so when I think about what is responding, what is the difference between those two, it's the exact opposite of everything I wrote down for reacting, being instead of compulsive, it's choice-driven. Instead of instant, it's delayed. Instead of instinctual, it's more intuitive. Instead of being at the peak of energy, so the moment something happens, which also relates to instant, it's instead with a bit more calm energy. When the waves have resettled and then you respond, it's a bit more big picture driven. And I don't know if those things are really opposites to each other, but when I think about reacting to something, I think instinctually it's just our emotions, our physical sensations, and our thought process to just live. And even if it's not a life or death situation, like literally if it's just somebody saying something mean to you, your reaction is still a self-defense mechanism. So maybe I should have put self-defense. Would response be on the offense? Damn, there's so many layers, and context is important. But furthermore, the last thing I wrote was instead of easy, difficult, and instead of mindless, mindful. I consider myself to be a spiritual person. When I think about the things that give me deeper meaning to life, I have tended to gravitate more towards spirituality. I think it's really just everybody's acute to their own language when it comes to faith and belief and life meaning. And personally, I speak in a more spiritual tongue. Being that I like the spiritual world and also that I'm very interested in things like mental health, I've obviously read a lot of books about it. I hear a lot of opinions about it, and I feel like there's sometimes this unfair bias that being mindless is a surface level bad thing. And while it definitely can, again, context is absolutely everything in this life, because the context you give something immediately changes the meaning of the words we use, and the words we use are how we communicate. So mindless isn't a bad thing. Mindless means that you don't have time maybe to be mindful when we have to react to a dangerous situation. We don't have time to be mindful when in the moment something is happening and it's time driven and you might not have the chance to respond. many times throughout life, especially too, like it's interesting how social media, with its pros and cons, one of the pros of social media is that we have more time to think about what we're doing and saying before we hit the send button, before we press down, you know? But then again, interestingly enough, we still see a lot of people being more reactive online. Like it's not like social media came to be and now suddenly we all became super responsive and mindful in the things that we do and say. If you put anybody in a high stress situation where even if it's more on a subconscious level than an actual conscious or physical threat to one's well-being, we become much more reactive than we are responsive. And that can be looked at globally, that can be looked at more communally or in families or in one-to-one relationships, all the way down to you and yourself. In most situations when we have to be reactive or when we tend to be reactive, it is high stress situations or time-driven situations. So there's only a certain amount of time to react to something, so you have to react. You don't have time to respond. That said, I think there's a lot more opportunities in life to respond versus react, but we get so good or we get so used to perhaps reacting. Maybe we're very emotionally driven. For any of you out there that tend to be very deeply emotional, tend to be very sensitive, it's very easy to get swept up in being a bit more reactive, especially with things like emotions. When you're walking across the street and you see a car coming, you don't have time to be mindful and think of your response. There's a reason why instinctually you'll jump out of the way. Those are good situations where we need to be mindless. We need to not be all like, and actually be like, oh shit, like get out of the way, right? But with that out of the way, why is it important to choose to respond or to work on the habitual process of rewiring the brain to take a moment to respond to things that make us feel reactive, things that aren't instantaneously life-threatening like a car headed your way? Because then I think we can actually stop self-sabotaging to a degree that it becomes so normalized, so habitualized, that we become almost grumpy, cranky individuals that are constantly looking for anybody to like press us so we can just like get out this suppressed anger. So to me, when I think about even just the last 2 years, how it's been obviously much more high stress for nearly every single person globally, it makes sense to me then that we're seeing a lot more reactive responses to things. I'm seeing a lot more anger, division, fighting one side versus another side, and I don't do well in those situations. Hold up, let's flip that into a positive context. I'm really good at seeing both sides of a situation. So I'm a good mediator, I'm a good perhaps diplomat, but I'm also really sensitive, and so I get upset when other people are upset. Regardless of how diplomatic and both sides of the coin I can see things, I'm still really sensitive to the energies around those things. So for instance, when the whole world feels like it's one side versus another, even though in a deep, deep knowing way, I know there is no such thing as there only being two sides. You know, I think this is gonna get super deep and philosophical. This is the part where we get super deep and philosophical, but I think there's this really nice poetic symmetry with most things in life. When you look at the political spectrum of there being red versus blue or right versus left, I did that backwards, but needless to say, when you look at the difference of things like yin and yang, when you look at these binary genders of woman versus man, while we tend to look at this thing as very one-dimensional, meaning there's only two sides of the spectrum, only two sides, only one linear line with a halfway point. And a lot of people do believe that there really are only those two extremes and no ranges in between. I definitely am not one of those people. I think that you could have all kinds of ranges in between those two things, but I also don't think it's actually as linear as we see it. I think it's more spheric. Is that a word? What I mean by that is it's more like the infinity sign rather than just two sides of a spectrum. In order for there to be an expression of one side, it insinuates the other, because think of it like a coin. Like you can't have one side of the coin if there's not another side. Then it's just I don't even know what that would be. There would be no end. It would just be one side of something. It would be a piece of paper that you were looking at straightforward the way you're looking at your screen. But there's another side of your screen even if you don't see it. And because the other side of that screen exists, this side can exist. Am I making any sense? Like, you know the yin and yang symbol? The reason why the two dots exist in that yin and yang symbol is because there's always a little bit of one in the other, and it's only because of that interconnected sphere or interconnected infinity symbol, that we're able to even experience the wide ranges that exist on all of these things. This is why I don't believe that life is binary. This is why, as much as there is light and dark, night and day, there's also dusk and dawn and all of the hours in between. I don't just think that there's woman and man in a very gender sense. I think that there's all of these ranges that all the different fundamental parts of our characteristics can fall upon in terms of masculine and feminine. Although I do believe that in a historical context to culture, there is these more stereotypical ideas of what it means to be masculine and feminine. It just makes sense in my mind that as much as somebody can be super feminine, there's still always going to be parts of them that has a little bit of masculinity to it. As bright as someone can be, we all have shadows. In order for there to be life, there has to be death. In order for there to be death, there has to be life. Even when you look at the range of reacting versus responding, there's always all of these ranges within that scale. And holy, how did I get this off topic today? I don't know. I'm chatty today. I'm chatty every day. Why am I'm feeling self-conscious. I need to stop. Even self-consciousness though, even insecurity can only exist because there's such thing as confidence, you know? My brain is breaking. When you think about all of the areas that we tend to close down, shut down, get defensive, get angry, fight with one another, as much as all of these experiences are fully validating because they wouldn't exist if we weren't meant to go through them, we weren't meant to experience them. If we can get better at large and with ourselves at responding to situations rather than reacting to them, whether you fuck something up, excuse my language, instead of reacting and punishing yourself, if you're able to sit back and ask, what did I learn from this? You'll be so much better off. When it's in a one-to-one relationship and somebody says something to you that's really shitty, and maybe they're having a bad day, maybe not, there's no context for them to say what they said, if you can still sit back and choose to respond to that situation rather than react to it, odds are you'd be able to see where someone might be hurting, choose a response that will help further you along on the healing process and not carrying that toxic energy with you. And also too, it'll just leave you less affected, less care. You know, when we react to things, especially when I think about two people going at it, if somebody says something to me, and I get shitty things said to me very often, when I react to it, I carry that shit around all day. When I sit and then I respond to it, I'm able to let it go in peace, knowing that even though it still sucked, even though it still is an uncomfortable feeling, I feel better off. So how can you bring this down to actually benefit you more in the day-to-day life? And it doesn't necessarily need to be a stress response. Like, we react when we see something funny by laughing. That's reacting, right? You don't think about whether or not you're gonna laugh, you just laugh. So again, context being everything, but I'll use stress-induced situations because this seems to be where we self-sabotage by reacting over responding. As long as we're safe, bringing a sense of mindfulness into our day-to-day lives, giving yourself in whatever capacity or through whatever tool or translation works best for you to really thread through situations and think about them very deeply. And again, you don't have to drown yourself in it, but just let's say you get into a disagreement with someone you really love, and instead of reacting with the emotional urgency to allow them to know how they're making you feel, sit in the discomfort of the feelings of the things that create a stress response in you. Sit with the words that someone might have said and find in your heart of hearts, well, one, if it's really hurting you, then that means that either one, you're afraid there's a little truth to it, or two, the person that's saying it to you holds pretty heavy weight in your heart. And then three, if you can sit with that feeling, if you can sit with the idea of, wow, this is deeply uncomfortable, but holy shit, I'm not dying. I'm gonna be okay. I'll survive. Once you make it past that acknowledgement in the mind, especially moving through something mindfully, be it journaling, be it sitting in meditation, talking it out with a third party, that is when we're able to pick a path. That is when we're able to respond. That is when we're able to make the right choice, to be more intuitive or to tap into our intuition for the choice that will actually lead us better off in the long run. That's when we're able to be a bit more mindful, however more difficult. That's when we're able to look at things more full picture. And that's when we can come at life with a bit more of a calm energy. And I'm not trying to lace this with toxic positivity either, because it is very, very valuable to feel out the emotions that we have. We need to complete our stress cycle. So even in a stress-induced situation, it's not to say suppress the stress and then be all calm and zen. It's more so to, if you can, if you're not in a time-driven situation, take a step back to let the stress cycle complete, reminding yourself and your primitive brain that you're alive, you're okay, you can survive this threat, so that then you're able to reintroduce yourself to the situation with the stress cycle complete and choose a more calm response. If you're angry, go be angry. Like, I'm not saying don't be angry. Go be angry, go be sad, go feel all the things you gotta feel, as uncomfortable as they are. And then in the aftermath of completing that cycle, whether it's crying, whether it's working out, whether it's going and doing something that just like gets out that energy, specifically I think of anger. Anger is appropriate in many situations, but again, bringing it back to reacting versus responding, if it's not an actual in-the-moment life-threatening situation where anger actually can be very well equipped to keep us alive, instead, if we can go complete the stress cycle of something like anger and let something out, then I'm able to come back to a situation with a much more clear head and calm energy and much more decisive and much more intentional with where I want to take the lesson of the challenge and move it with me or move forward from it. So anyway, those are my thoughts today. I'm sorry if I jumbled on or trailed off at any point. I'm really trying to get better at this. Every time I turn on my camera, man, it's definitely a self-awareness moment. Worst habit with however many years I've been online now is that I've introduced myself to so many opinions that my brain can't even fathom it. And so my brain tries to do this really intelligent but also self-sabotaging thing of trying to appease everybody, not say anything wrong, and then so I'm constantly censoring myself as I speak and then worrying about judgments that aren't even my own but that I can hear in voices that don't exist. It's super messed up. These are meant to just feel like hanging out. And I know I've said this before, especially in more previous coffee talks, but I'll keep reiterating it as my content evolves, as I grow and evolve, that this is genuinely just hanging out, chatting amongst a friend. I definitely don't claim to be a specialist, a professional. I don't claim to be superior to you. I don't think that any practice, any person, combination of birth charts all the way down to combination of personality traits or life achievements or, education achievements, how much money you got, any of it. I don't think that any range of that makes anybody more superior to anybody else. I think we're all deeply complex, but very, very beautiful individuals. And so coming on here is always a blessing. Hanging out with you is always a blessing. And hearing your thoughts about the things that I bring to the table is always a blessing. So please feel free to leave your thoughts on anything I may have spoken of down below. And if you did answer that thought or that initial prompt or question of what do you think the difference is between reacting and responding, and perhaps the context that would call for either or. And without further ado, I'm sending you guys all a big, giant coffee cheers, and I'll talk to all of you guys in the next coffee talk. Bye, guys.